Hello, and happy Monday, everybody. Hello, let's get this party started. I hope that you are well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am Karissa Span, the landlord and tenant coach. This is what I do each and every Monday at 7:30 p.m. So today is all about Q&A Ask Karissa. And so if you are a landlord or a tenant, if you have questions pertaining to anything, property management, landlord and tenant related, that's what this segment is for. I promise you that this will be an interactive session. So if you have questions, go ahead and drop it in the comment section. For those of you who are new, who are tuned in for the very first time, let me say welcome to my channel. Thank you for tuning in on my Facebook page as well as YouTube. So any questions, any comments that you have, I will be addressing them today. All right, so today is all about Q&A. I know that some of you have had questions. I received your emails. I received your text messages. And I checked my DM just recently. So I will be answering all the questions that I have so far. Please don't be a stranger. If you can hear me, if my sound is okay, in the comment section, just go ahead and say, hey girl, hey. All right, I want to greet some people who are here. Hello, Sissy. Thank you so much for tuning in from Brooklyn, New York. Hello, Maria. Thank you so much. I am trying to work through the technical difficulty, my team and I, so I hope that the sound is okay. Hello, Lynette, thank you so much for tuning in from Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte is checking in. Hello, Lynn. Thank you so much, beautiful, for tuning in. Hey, Dee. Thank you, sir. Hope that your day was well. Hello, Kimberly Parker. Hey, girl. Hey. So we have New York is in the building. South Carolina is in the building. Charlotte, North Carolina is in the building. DC metropolitan area. I see you all. Listen. So again, I'm just going to be answering questions today. Some questions have come in. So if you see me looking down, I'm looking at some of my emails and my text messages that have come in today. So the biggest question I received so far, received four questions, and it's along the line of courts. And people are asking, Karissa, are the courts open for landlords to take tenants to court? I received the question, that same question, from a tenant who has obviously been delinquent on their rent, and they wanted to know if their landlord have the right to take them to court right now. And so in many jurisdictions, yes, the courts are open and they are starting to schedule cases, and courts, the judges, they are actually hearing cases. And so if you are a landlord and you've been waiting for the day or the time, the opportunity to take a tenant to court for non-payment of rent or lease violations, please contact your local courthouse just to confirm that cases are being heard. Please also check for any changes or updates. So I do know that because of COVID, that many jurisdictions have changed the requirements for landlords to take tenants to court. So whereas before a landlord could send a 30-day notice, now things have become a little different. And in many areas, a lot more complicated or challenging. So please contact your courthouse. Please make sure that if you are not knowledgeable about landlord and tenant laws, that you go ahead and maybe contact an attorney, because the information that I give is not legal advice. It is the industry's best practice. And so this is why I said to check the county courthouse, the city courthouse, wherever that rental property is, so that you'll know firsthand what is required of you. You know the timeline, you know how many days you need to give your tenant. And in some places, you also have to translate the leases. And so, for instance, if you have a tenant who speaks English, and then you have another tenant who speaks Spanish or Amharic, I know I just messed that all up. But if you have tenants who are foreign, in many jurisdictions, you will have to translate that lease into their language. So find out what you are required to do in that particular jurisdiction. All right, so let me go to some questions that have come in. All right, so my first question is, do you have to pay late fees when you go to court or just the rent? Great question. So tenants, if you have a question pertaining to late fees. It just depends on where you are located. Number one, contact the courthouse because many courts are allowing landlords to now charge a late fee. So if you have to go to court, you may be responsible for the rent plus late fees or just the rent. So please find out from your particular jurisdiction what is required of you. Okay. Hey Pete, thank you so much. You are right on time, Pete. Thank you for joining us today. So Pete, today I am answering questions. So this is just Q&A. This is what we do monthly. You already know. But for those who are just tuning in for the first time, I just wanted to just explain the process. So I'm not going to go in any particular order. I will be answering questions in the order that they have come in, either by text messages, emails, or my DM. All right. So here is another question. If you have COVID and you have a court date, how would you go about handling that? Great question. And so if you are sick, if you have COVID, if you are ill and cannot make the court date, I would recommend to contact the courthouse first thing in the morning. If you know, for instance, if maybe you're going to be in a hospital, you have scheduled surgery, and you know in advance, I would say contact the courthouse in advance. Let them know that you have a medical emergency or you have a medical appointment and you will not be able to make the court date. Ask the county's clerk who answers the phone, what can you do to reschedule that court date? Don't just assume that because you have COVID or because you are sick that they will automatically excuse you, because I don't know the circumstance. I don't know the situation. True story. I had a tenant who I had been back and forth to court about, right? And every time I went to court, this particular person, they called the courthouse the day of the court case, and they kept telling the judge, well, I can't make it. I'm in a hospital. I'm sick. I don't have transportation. I'm in a wheelchair. And so I guess the judge finally felt my pain because I was really tired of hearing that. And not to say that your question is not legit or honest, but you have some people who abuse the system. And so obviously I was frustrated because I spent gas, time out of my day running back and forth to the court building. And so after that fifth time, the fourth time, the judge was like, okay, we're going to give them one last time. I was really upset. So that fifth time, the judge remembered, just looking at the documents in the court system, that this particular tenant had rescheduled it and came up with an excuse every single time. So that fifth time, the judge did allow my attorney and I to move forward with doing what we had to do in that particular court case. So it just depends, but that's a great question. Please contact the courthouse to find out what you can do if you cannot make it, obviously. And in a lot of places, the courts are done virtually. So some cases are being heard in the courthouse and some are actually done online. So it just depends on how it's being conducted. So hopefully, to the person who asked this question, hopefully if you know someone who has a court case coming up, hopefully it's not virtually, because if it's a virtual type of setting and you're not in a hospital, I'm not sure how the judge is going to handle that. All right, Kimberly, let me come to your question. Are there different rules on evicting senior citizens? Well, that's a great question. Now, especially in jurisdictions, Kim, where the laws are strongly in favor for tenants, yes, the courts, they will look strongly upon and in favor of seniors, because they recognize that sometimes seniors, they may need a little assistance. Some seniors may not have legal counsel. And so usually in a lot of jurisdictions and cases, the judge will, they'll be in favor of seniors. And so if you are a landlord, Kim, and you have a court case against a senior, I would contact your attorney to see, how, or to get their input to find out what they think the court favor or the ruling would be in terms of favoring that senior or not. Now, Kim, if you're asking that question to help other seniors in the community, then I would still say contact the courthouse to find out if there are any resources available, because usually the courts will try to find resources for seniors. So that is a great question. Thank you so much. Maria, here's your question. You said, can the landlord request that the tenant be responsible for keeping up the yard while renting a house? Absolutely. And Maria, I would take it a step further. With me being the landlord, I would put it in writing to say that is the tenant's responsibility if that's what I wanted for that particular rental property. Now, some landlords, Maria, don't put it in writing, and midway through the lease, they may ask the tenant if they could keep up the yard. Well, if it's not in writing, then obviously landlords cannot enforce something that does not exist. So hopefully there is an agreement. There is a contract, which is a lease, because again, that is a legally binding document. That's something that I've shared previously. So if it's in writing, then the tenant, if they sign a lease, they've already agreed to it. But if it's not in writing, and then all of a sudden the landlord asks for the tenant to do it, it's not a requirement that tenants do it. The landlord can ask, and if the tenant agree, then it's an agreement. But if not, then the landlord cannot make it a requirement. Hello, Jackie. Good evening, beautiful, and happy marvelous Monday. Thank you for tuning in. So today, Jackie, is all about Q&A. So I'm answering questions for landlords as well as tenants. All right, so let me go to my email. I have an email that came in. I have a landlord who is new in the rental property industry, and they are asking the requirement. So this landlord is in the DC area, and they are asking what is required of them to rent their property in the District of Columbia. That is a great question. Thank you so much. So here's my answer. In DC and in many places, you are required to have a business license, or what Maryland call it, a renter's license. So essentially that is making sure that your property is set up legally to function and to operate as a business. So please make sure that you are checking your what you have in place, whether you are set up as a business or you just want to rent your rental property out. Because if it's the latter, you definitely don't want to get yourself in trouble. So go ahead and make sure that you get a business license, and that will require an inspection to take place. So DC has an inspections office, which is ran by the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs. They will send an inspector out. Now, don't be alarmed when the inspector comes, because when you are trying to get a business license, they will do an inspection. It doesn't cost you anything extra. You pay that one fee, and that includes the inspection. So when the inspector come out, they're going to look at the rental property. So if it's a house, if it's a condo or a townhouse, whatever the structure is, you're going to pay the fee. They will schedule a date for either the inspector to come out or to have the inspection conducted virtually. Now, if there are any things that are deficient that needs to be completed or done in the property, that inspector's job is to let you know what you must do in order to legally operate that rental property business. Here's where some people get upset because they don't like to fail inspections. But here's the thing. Inspections are only in place to make sure that the rental property is decent, safe, and sanitary. So you want an inspector to come out and let you know if you have issues, because I would rather, as a landlord, have an inspector to tell me, well, Karissa, this is what you need to do. Karissa, do A, B, C, X, Y, Z. I would rather have that happen versus me not knowing about needed repairs. Something happens in a rental property and the tenant turns around and sue me. And so having that inspection done is definitely a good thing. Don't be alarmed. If you get a list of repairs or renovations that are needed, go ahead, take care of those renovations first, because sometimes spending a few hundred of dollars on repairs is a whole lot cheaper than the thousands of dollars that you'll spend if something happens when you have a tenant and they take you to court. Great question. Okay, Lynn, here's your comment. Make it a part of the lease if you already have them in there. When you renew it, put it in. Okay, so this goes back to Maria's question about tenants having to be responsible for keeping up the yard while renting a house. Absolutely, Lynn. Make sure it's in writing. And if it's not in writing, if you are able to, or at any point when you're able to renew the lease, and if it's something that you want to add, go ahead and have that language added into your lease at the point of renewal. Thank you for that, Lynn. All right, so let me go to my next question here. Does your apartment insurance have to cover the expense for bed bugs, or does the apartment complex covers it? Great question. Thank you so much for that. So when it comes to tenants and renters insurance, I strongly recommend to get as much coverage as possible that will help you in the event that there is a situation where there's a pest control issue, and you as a tenant is responsible for paying out of pocket. I do know that bed bug cost is not cheap. I have paid in the thousands of dollars for a rental property that I've managed where the tenant was responsible for the infestation. However, when that owner initiated the lease before I came in to assist them with this rental property, this owner did not put it in the lease saying that it was a tenant's responsibility. So if it's in the lease and as a tenant, you sign that agreement acknowledging that you are going to be responsible for the cost of infestation if you don't report it timely, please make sure that when you are contacting insurance companies to get yourself some good renters insurance, see if that is a clause, how much more that would be if it's not included. There are different options available for tenants, so there's no harm in asking that question. And if you are a tenant watching and you do not have renters insurance, please check into that, because you may be surprised that renters insurance is not really expensive, and it could definitely cover a lot of expenses that the landlord won't pay if something happens to you or your rental property, or if you are found negligent for any particular reason that your insurance policy will cover. So thank you so much for that question. Hey, Sam, thank you for tuning in. You said, how is DCRA inspection different from DC housing? Great question. So when it comes to DCRA, Sam, those inspections are pretty much making sure that the property meets the code for the District of Columbia. Now, when it comes to any particular housing subsidy program, usually, Sam, there is an inspection to make sure that the property meets the criteria of that particular program. So for the DC Housing Authority, I do know that that is a federally funded program. If it's, well, let me just say that if it's the Housing Choice Voucher program, if it's a federally funded program, the Housing Authority is required to make sure that that particular property meets the federal code, right? So you have federal codes and then you have city or local codes. But usually that particular city or jurisdiction, their codes, let me just back up, in any housing program, those codes will likely line up with that particular city or jurisdiction. So in DC, Sam, the voucher program, they will adopt not just the federal codes, but they will also adopt DC codes. DC Consumer and Regulatory Affairs, DCRA, they will make sure that if there are complaints, and these are completely separate from the DC Housing Authority. So if a tenant has a complaint, or let me go here, if a neighbor has a complaint about the rental property, they can contact DCRA. True story. A property that I currently manage, the neighbor contacts me at least, I cannot even make this up, the neighbor contacts me at least 3 to 4 times a week because of the tenant that's in the rental property. And if I don't take action, that I'm sure that neighbor will contact DCRA, who then come out and possibly fine, not me because I take care of repairs, but they will fine a landlord or owner if the property is not clean, maintained. Sam, I have seen owners get a fine for trash, okay, where a tenant may have put bulk furniture such as a sofa, dresses, mattresses outside and don't notify the landlord, right? And so DCRA came out because obviously somebody called to report it. So DCRA, they came out, they verified that there was bulk trash, so that it was improperly disposed of debris and waste. And so owners can be fined. So DCRA inspectors are very different from the Housing Authority inspector. So if you do get a complaint, if you do get a fine, if you get a notice of an infraction from the city inspector's office, go ahead, take it seriously, because if you don't respond and they fine you, you'll be responsible for paying it. But if you act promptly, then sometimes, and in many cases, you can send your response in, Sam, with a picture or invoice, saying, hey, I received this infraction. However, I'm not, how would you word it? I'm not responsible for the fine because we took care of the repairs. Please see a copy of the invoice that's enclosed or attached so that you can dispute it. So the biggest thing between DCRA and DC Housing Authority when it comes to negligence is that DCRA fines can be costly. So for instance, you could be fined $1,000, I believe it is. I don't remember the exact amount, but you could be fined, let's just say hypothetically, you could be fined $1,000 for not having a smoke detector. And not only would you be fined, but that is a 24-hour violation. Whereas with the DC Housing Authority, you won't get a fine. They'll just give you a list of repairs that you have to make sure that their rental property is decent, safe, and sanitary. So whenever DCRA comes in, that's usually more money. You don't want that. But if you get a fine, if you get an infraction, dispute it, especially if you have taken care of repairs or if you have repairs scheduled. So great question. Thank you for that, Sam. Okay, Maria, you said, I have it in writing. They don't keep it up. Okay, so if you have a tenant who is not adhering to the lease, go ahead and send them a letter, Maria, letting them know, hey, this is just a reminder that according to the terms of the rental lease agreement, paragraph, and then state the paragraph A, paragraph 3D, which states that you're responsible for the upkeep of the yard. Let them know what the lease says. Remind them that it is in writing. Let them know that they are in violation. And if they are participating in any housing program, let them know that not only is it a violation of their lease, but let them know that it also violates the program that they're participating with, and they could possibly lose their housing. Now, I like to go a step further, Maria. What I also do is when I send a letter out to a tenant, I'll state it in the letter, and I'll also make a copy of that particular paragraph in that lease. So if it's on the 6th page or the 49th page in my lease, I'm going to make a copy, and in the letter, I'm going to say, please see attached. Because if I have to take them to court, it's not what we know, is what we can prove, right? So I'll be able to have the letters showing the judge, Your Honor, I've notified the tenant that they are violating the lease on January the 10th. I notify them, Your Honor, on December 27th. Your Honor, we also notify them in writing on November the 1st. So you want to create a document trail. You want to create a document trail. Also, make sure that if you have pictures, if you have a video showing that there is a violation, the trash not being picked up in the yard, the grass not being cut, go ahead and take those pictures. And sometimes I'll even attach those pictures with the letter that I send to the tenant. But that's a great question. I had a tenant in DC. This young lady, for whatever reason, she lived in a beautiful, beautiful large home, and she never cut the grass. So at one point, the grass was almost as tall as I am. And fortunately, the city didn't come out to see that, because I could have received a fine. But the tenant, she kept promising, Karissa, I'm going to get my uncle to come and cut the grass today. I'm going to get my uncle to come and cut the grass tomorrow. And so the neighbors kept complaining. The neighbor contacted my office repeatedly. This tenant is not cutting the grass. It's a large single family home. It was in an area where snakes enter into the yards. And so obviously all the neighbors, they were concerned that the grass was not being cut. So I just had to remind the tenant to say, hey, listen, I really don't want to take you to court for this, but I could. So please make sure you get your uncle to cut the grass. I did also let the tenant know that, listen, we could take care of this problem for you. However, you will be responsible for the cost. I'm not sure how much that's going to be. And I can't guarantee that it's going to be cheaper than having your uncle to come out and do it. So I put it back on the tenant. Would you like for your uncle to do it, or would you like for me to send someone? But the grass must be cut. Let's say today is Monday. I'll let the tenant know the grass must be cut by Wednesday. So definitely put it in writing. And I know that because the courts are slow in opening back up and hearing cases, Maria, that sometimes these tenants, they recognize that, you know what, I'm not going to court right away, so I'm not really worried about that. But the courts are now starting to hear cases for violations of the lease. So have that conversation with your tenant. Remind them that it is their responsibility to take care of that. But definitely send it to them in writing. And I know that sometimes people don't, as a landlord, you want to do the right thing. You have a heart for helping people. You want to provide a decent rental property so that families can live in. And unfortunately, you have some people, you have tenants or renters, if you will, who don't appreciate good landlords that want to really do the right thing. So have that conversation with your tenant. And hopefully it doesn't have to get to court level. But if it does have to get to court level and you find yourself going down that road, just make sure that you have created your paper trail. All right. All right. So let me go to my next question here. So you're saying when you sit out bulk items on your property that you are renting or owned, you have to notify your neighbor. No, thank you for that question. No, I'm not stating that you have to notify the neighbor. I may have misspoken. In that particular case, what I was trying to convey is that when tenants sit bulk items out, sometimes neighbors will complain to the owner or the property manager to say, hey, listen, there are items out, or sometimes the neighbor may not even contact the owner. In that case, the neighbors can contact the inspector's office to complain that there is trash out there, because what happens? Think about what happens if there are large items of trash out there, or just trash in general, that was sit for days at a time, for weeks at a time. Things begin to happen. It attracts rodents and all types of not so great on the eye type of situation. So in cases where that is an issue, neighbors of that particular rental property, they can contact the inspector's office. And so that's what I was trying to convey. But thank you for that question so that I can clear that up. So whether you are the tenant, someone who is renting, if there are bulk items that are set out, please contact the landlord or someone, whoever is responsible for getting those items picked up, because we usually, as housing providers, we usually don't want trash all over the yard, because it's just not good to look at. It's not good to smell, and it just creates a whole bunch of other issues. So thank you for that. All right, so let me go to another question that came in. So I have a question from a landlord who is asking about marketing and advertising. And so their question is, Karissa, how do I attract my ideal tenant? Pete, I'm coming to you. So great question. And this is what I teach. This is what I share in my coaching program for my landlords in my master strategy program. So when you are trying to identify your best tenant, your ideal tenant, the first thing I always ask is this: what type of tenant are you looking for? Where do they hang out? What are some of their hobbies? What do they enjoy doing? Where do they spend time? Think about all those things. Think about what your ideal tenant looks like, right? And so I had a young lady who said, well, Karissa, I want a working professional. So I said, okay, that's great. How old or how young is this person? And so when you can identify what your ideal tenant look like, now let me just pause when I say this, because I'm not really getting into coaching, but I'm just answering this question. In identifying your ideal tenant, you want to make sure that you are not breaking any laws. So for instance, it is illegal and against the law. In some cases, there are some exceptions. All right. It is against the law to say, I don't want to rent to dark-skinned people. I had a client who said to me, Karissa, I will rent to African Americans, but I don't want to rent to dark African Americans. And although I understood based off of what they shared with me, I understood the reason for that, but that is still discrimination. So they didn't understand that it was discrimination because they said, well, I will rent to African Americans. And that's good, but you can't rent to a particular color, okay? Because that violates fair housing laws. So please make sure that when you are looking for your ideal tenant and you identify what that person looks like, that you are not violating the law. All right. Pete, you said in Baltimore, you notify bulk trash. They'll let you know what day they're coming, place the bulk trash out the day of. Pete, in many places, that's how it is. That's how it is. I know in DC and other jurisdictions. But sometimes, Pete, you have tenants and renters and people who don't know to call or to contact bulk trash. And so they'll just put their things out because maybe they're moving or maybe they're getting their tax refund, they're purchasing new items and they're getting rid of old stuff. There are all sorts of reasons why people get rid of stuff, Pete, and they don't know to ask. And so, but I definitely agree with you. You said what someone actually said that, yes. And so, but that conversation came about because I help people to identify their ideal tenant and how to market and advertise towards that particular population. And so, in a moment of honesty and transparency, yes, they did say that to me, and they said it in a safe place. So they know that when they share that information with me, they will not get in trouble, because if they say something that violates the law, it's my job as a landlord and tenant coach to educate them on what they can and cannot do. So yes, someone actually did say that, because I ask those questions. I want people to know. I want people to have an idea. I want people to have a working knowledge of what they can and cannot do. I want them to understand, okay, if you want, for instance, Sam is a landlord. He has multiple tenants, right? So Sam has market tenants. Sam has tenants who are in some sort of housing subsidy program. And so if a landlord has a preference to say, well, I would love to rent to participants in a voucher program or some sort of housing subsidy program, that's their choice. They can say that. And so I help them identify, okay, well, if that's the population, then now let's create a strategy where we can market and advertise to that population of tenants. I had a company, one of the largest family-owned investment companies. I took them on as a client many, many years ago. They had never rented to the affordable housing population. They've always only rented luxury high-end rentals. And so when they came to me, obviously they needed some assistance. They needed someone who was knowledgeable and specialized in affordable housing, which is what I do. And so I guided them on how we would create a marketing campaign and a marketing strategy to reach that population of tenants. Is it against the law? It's not against the law to know what you want and to market towards it, as long as it is not discriminating. So yes, people can actually say that, Pete, in a safe place and be okay. All right, let me go to my next question. If you're watching, if you're just tuning in, I'm answering questions today. So today is all about Ask Karissa, Q&A, landlord and tenant questions. So if you have a question or comment, drop it in the comment section. I am now looking at some emails that have come in. Okay, so I have a landlord who is asking about the lease renewal. She says, Karissa, I have a tenant who's been in my property for 6 years. She refuses to sign the lease renewal. I've never asked for one. I'm now asking for a lease renewal so that I can change the terms of the lease. What should I do? Great question. Okay, so if you are a landlord and you have a tenant who refuses to renew the lease in a jurisdiction where this particular landlord is in DC. So DC is a little different. Okay. This is not the answer for every area, because, for instance, Maryland, you can renew the lease. In DC, it is not a requirement for tenants to renew the lease. Tenants can actually refuse to renew the lease in writing in the District of Columbia, because DC is pro-tenant. Okay. So, for instance, in Prince George's County, Maryland, if a tenant refuses to renew the lease, the landlord can still take that tenant to court. Well, that's not the case in DC. So, my answer for this question may not be the same for your particular jurisdiction because I recognize that Atlanta is watching. I have Brooklyn viewers who are watching. I have Charlotte, North Carolina viewers who are watching, and the laws are going to be different or could be different just depending on where your rental property is. So, for this particular landlord, they have a tenant in DC. This tenant is refusing to renew the lease, although this landlord has never asked for a lease renewal. So now this landlord, they recognize that because they have obviously watched me on these Mondays when I do these free landlord and tenant sessions, they recognize they would like to change some of the terms of their rental agreement. And so, unfortunately, my answer to you is you cannot require in the District of Columbia this tenant to renew the lease. If they don't want to sign it, you can take them to court, but no judge is going to put them out or evict them because they refuse to renew the lease. True story. I have a young lady who moved into an apartment. Her landlord transferred her from one apartment to another apartment. Okay. The landlord made the huge mistake of not getting this tenant to sign a lease. So the tenant had lived in another apartment for a number of years. Something happened, and so this landlord let this tenant move into another apartment, nothing in writing, no lease. And so now this landlord is pleading and begging and asking this tenant to please enter into a rental lease agreement. And the tenant absolutely refused in Washington, D.C. And guess what? There is nothing that this landlord could do about it. So please make sure that you understand the law for the jurisdiction that your rental property is in. I manage property. I have property in multiple jurisdictions. And so how I treat one tenant, I can't treat another tenant in a different jurisdiction the same way because the laws are different. So sometimes tenants will cooperate, sometimes they won't. So this is why I tell people you can always catch more bees with honey than you can with vinegar. So in other words, please don't be mean and be nasty as a landlord or a housing provider and turn around and expect a tenant to do what you want them to do. Okay. Sometimes it just doesn't work in your favor like that. Now, if you are not violating the law and the tenant is violating the law, then obviously you can take the tenant to court for violating the terms of their rental lease agreement. So it just depends on where the rental property is. So unfortunately for you, in the District of Columbia, you cannot require a tenant to renew the lease because when that lease is up, when that 1-year term is up, that lease automatically transferred to a month-to-month situation. How long could that tenant stay there? Forever, as long as they are not violating the lease and as long as the rent is being paid on that rental property. Unfortunately, that's how it is. And in other jurisdictions where it's pro-tenant, the same thing applies. So that's my answer to you on that. I know that that's probably not what you want to hear, but I just wanted to answer that question for you. All right, so I'm going to take a couple more questions and then I'm going to wrap up for today because I've gone over in my time and I usually log off after about maybe 25, 30 minutes. So if you have any last minute questions, go ahead and drop it in the comment section today. I will answer that. But here is my last question that I'm going to answer, which did come in by way of email. I have a question, but this is from a tenant. So this tenant is asking, he said, Karissa, I have a landlord who refuses to make repairs. He said that he has reached out on numerous occasions trying to get the owner to make repairs, and they still refuse to come out and make repairs. So they are asking, can they take this landlord to court? That's a great question. And I love when questions come in from tenants because I want tenants to understand that they do have rights. Tenants have rights. And that's one of the things that I share so frequently for landlords to understand and know that And although they may own the property, tenants do have rights. And so my answer to you with this question about your landlord not making repair and if you can take your landlord to court, you absolutely can. True story. There, there's a large apartment complex in Washington, D.C. I knew the owner because someone brought me in to help manage this rental property. Unfortunately, the property was so bad that I couldn't put my name on it. The landlord had not made repairs in years in any of their property, and they had a lot of property throughout DC. I'm coming to your question, Kenyatta. And so in that particular community, this landlord was required to make repairs. It did not happen. So the tenants, they all filed complaints in the city courthouse against this landlord. The landlord was fined for not making repairs. The judge told the landlord, listen, if you don't make the repairs, you're going to get locked up. And so obviously the owner did not take the judge seriously and still did not make the repairs. And so not only did that owner get locked up, him and his wife, they were both locked up for failing to make repairs. They ended up losing that property. That property, it went into receivership. That's something that you never want to happen. You never want, as an owner, please hear me when I say this. You never want the courts to come in to take control of your property because all the money that comes in must go into the court registry. When it goes into receivership, when it's that bad, you can't even collect money that's in the court registry until you make the repairs. And on a couple of his properties, they still had a mortgage to pay. They still had bills to pay. They still had to maintain utilities. And they are required by law to maintain the rental property and to make sure the utilities are on. The water bill still has to be paid. And it was the owner's responsibility. The utilities such as electric in the common area, there was a house meter. And that landlord was still responsible for making sure the electric was on, although they could not physically collect money. And so it is always in the owner's, the landlord's best interest to make repairs promptly because, yes, tenants can take landlords to court for not making repairs. Great question. Kenyatta, how do you handle a situation when the house is for sale, but... Okay, Kenyatta, restate that, please. How do you handle a situation when the house is for sale, but the lease is not in place? Is that what I'm not sure. Kenyatta, restate your question for me, please. I want to make sure that I'm answering it correctly. Okay, so Kenyatta, let me just take a stab at this. So how do you handle a situation when the house is for sale, but there is no lease in place? It just depends on the jurisdiction. For instance, if it's in Maryland or DC, doesn't matter. The courts may ask the tenant to move. If it's a possibility that, okay, here is the clarification here when the lease is still in place. Okay, so if a house is for sale and a lease is in place, it depends on the jurisdiction. So in some places, the courts will allow tenants to stay in place during the sale of the property. In other areas, the court may tell the tenant that they have to leave. So for instance, if there's a lease in place, let's say the tenant has not paid rent, right? For whatever reason, the judge may ask the tenant to move or give the landlord permission to file an eviction if the tenant doesn't move. So it really does depend in some area. So for instance, and I always talk about DC because DC is just so pro tenant. DC is one of the worst areas. Okay. Let me just say that. And I know some of my colleagues don't like me saying that, but it's the truth. And I believe in shooting straight from the hip. So in areas such as DC, Kenyatta, I know that you know this. When there's a tenant in place, that new owner, unless they are taking possession of their property um, for themselves for personal use and occupancy, they may not be able to force that tenant out. And so I would always check with the laws in that particular jurisdiction to find out what is going to happen. So for instance, with me purchasing property, I usually will not look if it's a property that I want to maximize my income, right? On that particular property that I'm purchasing. I always want to purchase a property that's vacant. I don't want a tenant in there. Here's why. And I know that some real estate agents might not like me for this, for sharing this. But usually what happens is if you have a tenant in place, if you're purchasing a rental property, you're purchasing a home that has a tenant in place, sometimes the most that you can get for the rent is what is currently being paid. So there may be a slight percentage increase that is allowed, but for the most part, let's say for instance, if the rent is $600 a month, right? This tenant has been there for 50,000 quadrillion, zillion, billion years. Okay. That's not a word. I just made it up. Right. So a tenant could be in the property for that amount of time, right? Paying $600. But now the market has changed. Everything is being built up. They're building up the whole community, Kenyatta. They're throwing up new homes. The value of the property has increased. You want to come in, you want to purchase the property, right? And you want to take the rent from $600 to $3,400. Well, you can't increase the rent like that because there is only so much. There's a percentage. There's a rent increase index in many places where owners must abide by. So usually for me, I would not advise, okay? I would not advise people to purchase property where a tenant is in place unless, let me just state, and this is what I share in my coaching program, helping people to understand how to get the best bang for their buck, unless, all right, they do some research first, meaning that the potential owner, right? The buyer, if you're the buyer, you do some research, you get the rent roll, you get the ledger, you get the delinquency report to find out, okay, how much is coming in from that property? Has the tenant been responsible? And have they paid their rent each month? So if you do your research, the rent is along the lines of what you're willing to accept. And if it's a deal, go ahead and work the deal. But definitely do your research. If it's not working, don't do it. So that's my response. When the lease is in place, how do you handle a situation where a house is for sale and there's a lease in place? I like to encourage a cash for keys deal. All right. So cash for keys is when an owner comes in, or whether it's the buyer or the seller, they're trying to get the tenant out. So they're willing to pay tenants cash to give them the keys, meaning that they're willing to pay the tenant to move out of the rental property. And so I would just have that conversation to encourage the tenant to vacate, just depending on the budget. I have gone as far as offering cash for the keys. I've gone as far as offering storage. I've gone as far as being willing to pay for the security deposit and 3 months rent to get the tenant out. So it just depends on the situation and what that looks like. So if it's in the budget to do a cash for keys deal, that's a no-brainer. Go ahead and do it. But if not, check with the county to find out if in fact you are allowed, or if your client is allowed to, if you're the real estate agent, if your client is allowed to take this tenant to court for that lease. So it just depends. There are a lot of variables there, Kenyatta. All right, so I have one more question that came in by way of text message. Okay, I'm mistaken. All right, so that's it. My time is up. I thank you for yours. Listen, this is what I do each and every Monday. I share information for landlords and tenants to help the rental community. I am Karissa Span, the landlord and tenant coach. Please check me out on YouTube. If you are on Facebook, go to my YouTube page, subscribe to my YouTube channel, smash that subscribe button so that you'll be the first to know when I am live and online every Monday at 7:30 p.m. This is where you can find me. If you have questions, feel free to email me. Okay. I am available. I will answer as many questions as possible when I'm online, but I recognize that sometimes time is just not on our side. So it's been a plum pleasing pleasure to have you here. I thank you for all of the questions that have come in today. And I look forward to you joining me next week. Here is my email address. If you have questions, please email me. I'm carissaspan@gmail.com. You can also find me online at landlordlife.com. Check me out if you are a landlord. You are interested in my six-week intensive landlord and coaching master strategy program. I promise you it will be the best investment that you have made. I have improved it significantly. I love what I do. I love making a difference. And I hope that something that I shared today was of value to you. I look forward to you joining me next week, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Bye for now.